Just a quick question here from Kerrick asking us, when is the best time to take a swing trade entry? Do we need to wait for a pullback, or should we wait for the sentiment to turn, or should we just enter from a hard predefined level? Now, first of all, Kerrick, thanks for the question. Now, timing can often be a tricky part in trading. There's often lots of research being done about market timing, saying that time in the market is more important than timing the market. Now, even though I agree with that statement in terms of long-term, long-only investments like your retirement fund, investment funds, etc., it is very different when it comes to short-term trading, such as day trading and even swing trading, where your time horizon for trading is much shorter than a traditional type of investment. So, what is the best time for swing trading to enter the market? Now, if there was an obvious perfect entry, everybody would just, there wouldn't be this question, right? So everybody would just use that perfect method. So they, generally speaking, there's two approaches, but none of these two are perfect, right? So in both cases, the very first step, whether you take the first or the second approach, the very first thing that you always need to do is make sure that you conduct your fundamental analysis to make sure that you're trading in the right direction. And then you need to either rely on a purely technical entry by considering the current pullback in the trend that you are looking at. Let's go to a higher time frame for this, for the Aussie dollar versus the US dollar. So obviously, let's say you've done your analysis and you say that your fundamental bias is tilted to the downside for the Aussie dollar versus the US dollar. So then what you can do from the first method, looking at a purely technical method, is you can consider a possible entry by looking at various technical strategies, right? You can consider the pullback in terms of support and resistance zones. You could look at psychological levels. You could look at swing points. You could even look at Fibonacci retracements, and we use all of them, by the way, to look for possible entry places. Now, the second method or approach is to wait for the short-term sentiment to end. So basically waiting for the short-term sentiment that is currently pushing this pair against the fundamental bias, wait for that to end before you take your entry. Now, that way you will have the macro view as well as the sentiment view in your favor, which normally gives you a higher probability to the downside. Now, there's no perfect or right and wrong when it comes to whether you take the purely technical entry approach or whether you take a sentiment approach. There's going to be pros and cons to both. So if you take a purely technical entry, so let's use that 64.50 that we highlighted as an opportunity in yesterday's trade example for the Aussie US dollar swing trade idea. So if you take a purely technical entry, you drastically increase your chances of entering the trade from a higher probability level. So you always get a higher probability of entering because you're not waiting for sentiment. You're basically entering from a particular area that you view as having a high probability. You've confirmed it with various psychological levels like the 65 or the 64. You've basically analyzed it in line with support and resistance zone. So that is a high probability technical entry. And you normally get a much quicker or a much surer entry on that because you're not waiting for sentiment to change. Now, the con here is that you might be entering when the short-term sentiment is so strong that you might be sitting in an immediate drawdown for quite a long time until you wait for that sentiment in the short term to actually run out. So you might be entering here, but it might be going up all the way back up as long as that sentiment lasts, and then only it starts to turn down. Then with the second approach, you basically wait for the sentiment to change, right? So generally, the way that we prefer to do it is by waiting for that short-term sentiment to realign with the fundamental approach. The pros of that is that you only trade when the macro and the sentiment theme is aligned, giving you a much higher conviction in the trade, especially in the short term. The cons there, however, is that the sentiment can sometimes change so quick and so volatile that you might not get a good entry, and you might not get an entry at all. So there might not be a pullback, right? So if we go to, let's take a 1 hour view of this. We obviously wanted to enter at the 64.50 from a technical point of view, but we would have preferred to wait for the sentiment to change. Now, the sentiment has now changed, but we haven't really gotten any type of pullback in the pair yet to re-engage this pair to the downside, right? So there hasn't been an opportunity to really trade this. Now, what can happen if you wait for sentiment is you might not get a pullback. You might see this thing just, tumbling down without having any pullbacks like these ones. You might just see a big move like this one here, that didn't really give you an opportunity to re-engage the pair to the downside. So there is an obvious con for that. Personally, when it comes to this trade, I didn't wait for 64.50. As a technical level, I waited for sentiment to change. So meaning I didn't get that great 64.50 entry right up here. I basically waited for the sentiment to change. When we saw that break below 64, that was basically an entry point for me to get into the market. So it is really subjective. Sometimes it's going to be better to wait for a technical entry. Sometimes it'll be better to wait for the sentiment to change. Obviously, in hindsight, it's going to be an exact science, right? So in hindsight, you could have said, obviously, I needed to wait for this or that. So it's never going to be perfect. But generally speaking, the higher probability opportunities is waiting for the sentiment to change in line and then trading it to the downside. But if you don't have time sitting around at the desk the whole day, if you're having a full-time job, sometimes you'll need to take that 64.50 as a pending order and just trust in the fundamentals to move that in the right direction. So I hope that gives you some insight there, Kerrick. If there's any other questions, obviously, please don't hesitate to let us know.